Listen to me more. You have less problems. You know, you
Good morning,
complicate
everyone.
things.
I know it's 12:59, but you're all here and it's like I have to make announcements. I just have to fill it up. So I just want everyone to know that we're open for Shabbat all through winter vacation. We have a big holiday party on the Hanukkah Shabbat, which I think is the 19th. And you have to
Are you
sign up
going?
for that. That's going to be a lot of fun. And please watch your Macomb at home. I have my book group is meeting, Jean Meltzer's The 8 Heartbreaks of Hanukkah. That's next week. And also next week is our short story. I'm very excited about this morning. Now, I know people who know me say, you say that every week, but no, I am really excited this morning. We've had Professor Porwancher here before when he talked about his book, The Jews, what's the name of the book? The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton. So if you haven't read it, get that. We also have books on sale here. And of course, Andrew will be happy to autograph them for you. And we'll be getting one for the library. So here's my introduction. A native Princeton.
Or do you?
No, I talked to you.
Earned degrees from, this is really small.
How come that sound went down?
How come what?
Somebody, okay. I'm sorry. He earned degrees from Brown and Northwestern. That's pretty prestigious before completing his PhD in history at Cambridge. Wow. Currently, he serves as professor of history at Arizona State University. And I'm sure your classes are full. And I'd like, they've got that site where you can check your profession. We won't do that. His books include The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, it has a lot of awards, and this newest book, his fifth book, American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. And really, we can't wait to hear about it. And just a little reminder, we'll have time for questions. I will come to you, and Professor Porwancher will use a microphone. We use a microphone all morning so everybody can hear. Thank you all.
She says his name different than it's spelled. He's young.
Thank you so much.
How young he is.
Thank you, Lori, for that introduction and for the invitation.
He's like 50 maybe.
That goes into this today. And thank you to the bookstall for coming.
Right? If that even.
Oh, sorry, Vanessa.
Skin looks like he's 40, 45.
Forgive me. I just gave another talk at Temple Beth Israel with Lori, and this is Vanessa, and it's anyway, you'll forgive this desert boy braving the cold here and getting a little confused. It brings me a lot of nachas to be here. This is kind of a homecoming for me to come back to Chicago because I have a lot of family here. We just got a visit with my grandmother and grandfather who are still with us in their 90s. And as she mentioned, I went to Northwestern, and so it's really a joy to come back to Chicago and to come back to your community and give a talk. I think last time was during the pandemic and it was online. And so it's really a pleasure to be here in person. I want to thank all of you for trudging through the snow. And thank you to those of you who are Zooming in. I see you at home, and I'm really grateful as well. So with that, let me turn to the story of the American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. I wish I had a little Jew in me, Theodore Roosevelt once mused to a friend. Mere wishing would indeed mark the limits of Roosevelt's claim to Jewish ancestry. Not a drop of Israelite blood coursed through his veins. If anything, Roosevelt was the consummate insider of the Protestant elite that dominated American life in his era. His father, descended from a New York political dynasty whose eminence in Manhattan dated back to the days of Dutch colonial rule. His mother was a Southern belle of such renown that many thought her to be the inspiration for the character of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. Their son, Theodore, lived a life consistent with his patrician pedigree. He enrolled at Harvard. He served as a military officer. And he would ultimately seize the grandest prize of all, the Oval Office. This silver spoon statesman who had grown up in New York's fashionable neighborhood of Gramercy Park had little in common with the Yiddish-speaking immigrants moistening their brows in the sweatshops just a short walk away. Roosevelt's privileged path was even further removed from those Jewish souls still struggling to survive in Eastern Europe. And yet, for all the differences between TR and embattled Jews on both sides of the Atlantic, their causes became pivotal to his presidency. He would help shape their lives, and they, in turn, his legacy. The story of Theodore Roosevelt and the Jewish people begins not at the White House, nor in the shtetls of Russia, but rather in the beating heart of American Jewish life, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Oh, we already have it up. Great. To locals, it was simply called the East Side. One contemporary writer described the neighborhood as home to, quote, a Jewry that has burst all bounds. 6 days a week, commerce was the lifeblood on the Lower East Side. Every Friday at Hester Street, East Siders would gather at the ironically nicknamed Pig Market, where everything but pork was for sale. Buyers and vendors would haggle loudly over all manner of imaginable goods, from pants and pickles to spectacles and suspenders. 2 short blocks from the Pig Market on Allen Street was home to a notorious red light district, where Jewish prostitutes would hang red lanterns in their windows to signal their trade. One particularly well-known Jewish prostitute always took leave from work on the high holy days. As she explained matter-of-factly to a journalist, I go to shul. On nearby Forsyth Street, Congregation Temple Beth Shalom shared a wall with a brothel. Paying customers and praying congregants competed with one another for vocal supremacy. It was hardly atypical to find such sanctity and such sin commingling in turn-of-the-century New York. Just a few blocks away, if you turned right onto Houston Street, you would wind up at Katz's Deli, a favorite delicatessen of the actors who acted in the theaters that dotted the neighborhood. Has anyone eaten at Katz's before? We've got, okay, pretty good for a Chicago crowd. Now, those actors in the Yiddish theaters often staged Shakespearean classics, but with a Jewish twist. Lower East Side audiences were probably unaware that the original version of Hamlet did not have a subplot where the titular character trains to become a rabbi. Roaring above Allen Street was the elevated train. The pandemonium that prevailed in the train cars was every bit as frenetic as life below. Now, one Midwesterner who visited New York remarked after getting off the train that, quote, a moment's respite, a second's inattention from the dangling leather which hangs from the roof and you were shot into somebody's back, bosom, or belly. The elevated train afforded passengers a dark view into the grisly heart of the Lower East Side, the tenements. These 5 to 8 story tall brick buildings with their signature fire escapes zigzagging across the front facades were crammed with impoverished Jewish families. These buildings often doubled as sweatshops. The buildings seemed to embody the muted despair of some of their inhabitants. In the words of the Danish-American reformer Jacob Riis, quote, the thousands of lighted windows in the tenements glow like dull red eyes. But life was not all bleak on the Lower East Side. Thanks to free public schooling and a Jewish premium on education, Jewish families enjoyed a remarkable degree of upward mobility, with the children of Jewish families achieving a measure of success that their parents had rarely imagined for themselves. Newcomers to the East Side found that the religious strictures of the shtetl had given way to that most quintessential of American values, choice. Individual Jews were free to engage their heritage on their own terms, if at all. Some Jews fell in with socialism and its skepticism of religion. Others cast their lot with the anarchists who flouted Yom Kippur by hosting dances on the Day of Atonement. Individual Jews could choose how to do their heritage, and for the majority of East Siders, that meant choosing to sustain their ancient faith. Here then was America's largest Jewish community, old world tradition and new world temptation, grinding poverty and novel opportunity, communal belonging and individual freedom, Yiddish and English, piety and vice, all crammed into a couple square miles of teeming humanity. Slum life on the Lower East Side might have been rife with hazard, but it was also rich with hope. There was no edict precluding Jews from joining a given profession, no quota capping the number of Jewish students at a school, no pogrom to ransack Jewish businesses or spill Jewish blood. Instead of being relegated to second-class citizenship, an impoverished Jew could cast a ballot that tallied just the same as the wealthiest Gentiles. But the Lower East Side wasn't just the starting point for so many Jews grasping at the American dream. Amid that neighborhood's swarming streets, in the summer of 1895, a young police commissioner began chasing a dream of his own. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. And at just 36, he had become head of the NYPD as part of a reform movement sweeping New York and the nation. Well, go back one. We're going to be on this one for a while. This reform movement was sweeping New York and the nation at large. Now, Roosevelt was renowned for his boundless energy. Hardly content to stay chained behind his desk at police headquarters, Roosevelt took to the streets. Block by block, he barnstormed the Lower East Side as Jewish audiences crammed into various venues to hear the commissioner espouse his egalitarian ethos. Roosevelt's barrel-chested build gestured toward his physicality, his spectacles towards his intellectuality, his dapper attire toward his gentility. Roosevelt took a premium on recruiting Jews to the police force, partly as a matter of principle. He thought it important that the NYPD look like the city at large. And it was also a matter of practicality. He needed Yiddish-speaking officers who understood East Side residents literally and culturally. Roosevelt was always on the lookout to recruit what he called the Maccabee type of Jew. That is, the Jew whose vigor and valor was reminiscent of those ancient Jewish warrior rebels. When Roosevelt had said that he wished he had a little Jew in him, surely he meant this archetype of the American Maccabee. Now, for newcomers to the Lower East Side, the sight of a fellow Jew sporting a policeman's uniform was a stirring symbol of American possibility. Back in the old country, police had enforced discriminatory laws against Jews and had stood idly by as mobs mercilessly beat Jewish victims. But in America, Jews themselves could become commanding figures, defenders of the people and of the people's law. And of all the Maccabee types whom Roosevelt recruited to the police force, one stands out among the rest. His name was Otto Raphael. He had come over from Russia with his family when he was young, and they'd opened a struggling meat market on Allen Street in the heart of the Lower East Side. One evening, right around the time that Roosevelt became commissioner, Raphael was roused from bed by the scent of smoke. A nearby tenement was engulfed in flames. Raphael, then in his mid-20s, dashed into the burning building multiple times to save people trapped inside. Later that year, Roosevelt was giving a talk at a YMCA downtown, and Raphael happened to be in attendance. The philanthropist who had invited Roosevelt to speak asked TR if he wanted to meet the local neighborhood hero who had spared countless lives from an inferno. Roosevelt sized up Raphael and was impressed. He encouraged Raphael to try out for the NYPD, and when Raphael did, out of 380 applicants that cycle, he ranked 10th in mental aptitude and first in physical ability. He earned his spot on the force naturally, and it turns out that Roosevelt's newest Jewish recruit had a skill set of keen interest to the commissioner. Otto Raphael had some amateur boxing titles to his name, and he soon became Roosevelt's sparring partner. Their friendship, forged in the ring, would last a lifetime. Roosevelt would come to know Raphael's entire family, and Raphael would later visit Roosevelt at the White House. Now, as a reform-minded police commissioner, Roosevelt found common cause with other reformers seeking to ameliorate dire conditions on the Lower East Side. Foremost among them was 28-year-old Lillian Wald. Lillian Wald hailed from a wealthy German Jewish family in Cincinnati, and she had opted out of her life of privilege to go to New York and become a pioneer in what was known as the Settlement House movement, which was made famous in Chicago thanks to the likes of Jane Addams. The Settlement House movement was a movement designed to help immigrants adapt to the new ways of their adopted homelands. And they were called settlement houses because the people running them actually settled in the communities where they served. Lillian Wald prevailed upon Roosevelt to become an honorary inductee of her settlement house's American Heroes Club, dedicated to the study of great figures from U.S. history. Roosevelt must have been the only mustachioed member of the group. The other participants were local boys no older than 12. Now, Roosevelt's foray into this world of Lower East Side, Eastern European Jewry gave him his first sustained exposure to what were called downtown Jews, as opposed to the uptown Jews with whom he had previously fraternized. Uptown Jews luxuriated in expensive brownstones on fashionable streets. Downtown Jews crammed into East Side tenements. Uptown Jews had tended to come over in the middle decades of the 19th century from Central Europe, often Germany, and had become Americanized. Downtown Jews were recent arrivals from Eastern Europe, still learning the ways of their new homeland. Uptown Jews had met with success in banking and law. Downtown Jews subsisted in sweatshops and hawked goods from pushcarts. Uptown Jews tended to gravitate toward Reform Judaism. Downtown Jews tended to practice Orthodox Judaism. Roosevelt's entree into the world of downtown Jews was so well received that he became a frequent guest at Jewish weddings on the Lower East Side, often conferred the honor of escorting the bride or her mother to the banquet following the ceremony. Theodore Roosevelt had a conspicuous encounter with anti-Semitism in his first year on the police force. A notorious German Jew hater named Hermann Alvart was planning a trip to America to spread his hateful message. And he provocatively scheduled a lecture on the Lower East Side. Now, Alvart was almost cartoonishly villainous. The decade prior, Alvart had been fired as the headmaster of a school when it was uncovered that he had stolen the funds designated for the children's Christmas party. So I wouldn't look to an anti-Semite for the seed of integrity. Now, when Jews on the East Side caught wind that Alvart was coming to their own backyard, they approached Commissioner Roosevelt and asked TR to bar Alvart from speaking, or at least to deny him a police protection. Now, Roosevelt could not grant their request without undermining the principle of freedom of speech. And even absent that constitutional right, Roosevelt thought that preemptive censorship would only serve to turn Alvart into a martyr. Roosevelt would later remember thinking, quote, "The proper thing to do was to make him ridiculous." To that end, Roosevelt quietly resolved unto himself to pursue an exceedingly clever scheme. TR would indeed provide Alvart a police detail consisting exclusively of Jewish officers. Roosevelt told a deputy of his to round up a few dozen Jewish policemen and bring them to TR for his inspection. It was important to Roosevelt that these men look unmistakably Jewish. As Roosevelt told his deputy, quote, "Don't bother yourself to hunt up their religious antecedents. Take only those who have the most pronounced Hebrew physiognomy. The stronger their ancestral marking, the better." These Jewish officers were brought to Commissioner Roosevelt for his inspection. One of Roosevelt's friends would later write, "A more Hebraic group of Hebrews was never before gathered in one small room." Roosevelt then launched into a speech announcing to the men why he had gathered them. He said, quote, "Now I'm going to assign you men to the most honorable service you have ever done, the defense of religious liberty and the protection of an enemy in the chief city of the United States. You all know who and what Dr. Alvart is. It should be your pride to see that he is protected. That will be the finest way of showing your appreciation of the liberty you yourselves enjoy under the American flag." Now, about 150 people gathered at the Cooper Union Auditorium on the second night of Hanukkah to hear Alvart's much anticipated speech. The press estimated that a third of those in attendance were Jews who had come in protest, and another third were NYPD. Alvart took the stage at 8 o'clock that evening to a mix of scattered applause and shouts of disapproval. Whenever Alvart's remarks would veer into anti-Semitism, the crowd taunted him in return. But the galling grin plastered on Alvart's face remained unbroken. The night's greatest drama unfolded when Alvart derided Jews for their, quote, "odious peculiarity," prompting a Lower East Sider named Louis Silverman to cock his arm, egg in hand. As the New York Times reported, and I quote, "A nice white egg performed a graceful parabola through the air in the direction of Hermann Alvart, but he danced aside with an agility not indicated by his portly form, and the egg smashed and spluttered on the chair behind him. Now, not long after Roosevelt's 2-year stint on the police force, he found himself tasked with organizing a cavalry regiment to fight in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. It would become famously known as the Rough Riders. And Roosevelt's first order of business was to select from some 23,000 applicants the 1,000 men who would join him in battle. As with the police force, Roosevelt took great pride in assembling a heterogeneous group. He chose everyone from Western cowboys to Princeton alums, from Cherokee citizens to polo players, and yes, Jews as well. During their training, the Rough Riders took to giving each other ironic nicknames. Roosevelt would recall later that, quote, a young Jew who developed into one of the best fighters in the regiment accepted with entire equanimity the name of Porkchop. The Rough Riders landed in Cuban shores in June of 1898, and they were immediately beset with hazards: scorching sun, torrential downpour, punishing marches, muddy terrain, mosquito swarms. Naturally, Roosevelt endured these fraught conditions in a custom uniform that he had ordered for himself from Brooks Brothers. The Rough Riders' ultimate goal was the capture of the key city of Santiago. But to reach Santiago, they would first have to fight their way through the San Juan Heights, a series of hills manned by Spanish infantry. Roosevelt was fearless in the face of death. One of his men remarked, quote, he's always on ahead, waving a sword in one hand and a big revolver in the other, and yelling all the while like an attic full of cats let loose. Now, Roosevelt fought alongside these Jewish Rough Riders who became frequent subjects of stories in the Jewish press. The Jewish press back in America delighted in regaling their readers of these tales of Jewish gallantry, which helped defeat stereotypes that Jews were weak in body or disloyal to the nation. Theodore Roosevelt was a collector of stories, and his haul from these early years of his career had been particularly abundant when it came to Jewry. There was the story of Otto Raphael, the Jewish immigrant who braved a burning building and earned not just a police badge, but Roosevelt's friendship. There was the tale of Hermann Alvart, the German hate monger whom Roosevelt cleverly guarded with Jewish policemen. And there were the legendary Jewish Rough Riders who faced down Spanish bullets alongside their colonel. These were stories that mattered to Jewry and to Roosevelt alike, because they advanced an aspirational vision of American life in which Jew and Gentile would stand as equals. In this respect, Roosevelt cut a very different figure from some other members of the Protestant elite who were brazen in their anti-Semitism. Now, to be sure, there were some blue bloods within the Protestant elite who accepted Jews, but many others did not. A significant faction of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant patrician class was alarmed by the ascent of the new money crowd born of industrial capitalism. And uptown Jews who had successfully ridden the wave of a modern economy seemed to exemplify that threat. Now, of course, fears about a Jewish takeover of American life were wildly overblown. The silk-stocking Anglo-Saxons still enjoyed outsized control of American life. The scholar Henry Adams epitomized elite paranoia about Jewish domination. He was an heir to the Adams presidential dynasty, and despite his immensely privileged life, he was deeply threatened by the ascent of Jews in America. Henry Adams remarked to a British politician, quote, "We are in the hands of the Jews. They can do what they please with our values." And he likewise remarked to a senator's wife, quote, "In a world of Jews and brokers, a society made up of maniacs wild for gold, I have no place." And in his autobiography, Henry Adams shuddered at the, quote, "Polish Jew fresh from Warsaw or Krakow, a furtive Jacob or Isaac still reeking of the ghetto, snarling a weird Yiddish to the officers of the customs." Now, not everybody in the elite classes took Henry Adams seriously. John Hay was a high-ranking diplomat who laughed off Adams's paranoid anti-Semitism. As John Hay told a fellow diplomat about Adams's warped worldview, quote, "The Jews are all the press, all the cabinets, all the gods, and all the weather." Hay also once joked to a senator's wife that Adams was liable to blame Jews for the eruption of Italy's most notorious volcano. As Hay wrote, quote, "When Henry Adams saw Vesuvius reddening the midnight air, he searched the horizon to find a Jew stoking the fire." Now, thanks to the likes of Adams, Jews found themselves blackballed from various elite institutions, social clubs, summer resorts, prep schools. TR befriended Henry Adams and his ilk, but Roosevelt was not himself complicit in excluding Jews. In fact, when Roosevelt had been in his early 20s and first dipping his toes in New York's political waters, Roosevelt threatened to terminate his own membership in a Republican club when some fellow participants sought to exclude a Jewish candidate on purely religious grounds. When Roosevelt ascended to the presidency in 1901, the question of Jewish belonging at home would soon become eclipsed by the question of Jewish survival abroad. What Roosevelt did not yet know when he inherited the mantle of presidential power at the record age of 42 was that the momentous years now facing him would coincide with the greatest crisis for global Jewry of his lifetime. The Jewish people would pray that this youthful new president, this teller of Jewish tales, might prevent the next chapter in the Jewish story from being written in blood. It was Easter Sunday in the city of Kishinev, 1903. What began with some rowdy youngsters picking on Jews soon escalated into adults ransacking Jewish businesses. A mob overran the Feldstein Saloon on Armenia Street. One rioter found a slab of meat, climbed atop the roof, and announced to a horde gathered in the street below, "Here are the remains of a Christian child found in the home of the wealthy Jew." What ensued over the next 48 hours was a pogrom of such unconscionable barbarity that when its details became known, they would shock the American conscience. Russian authorities stood idly by as Russian Gentiles butchered their Jewish neighbors. In the end, 47 Jews were killed, 100 Jewish children were orphaned, and entire streets in the Jewish neighborhood demolished. Kishinev Jewry lay in abject ruin. This catastrophe prompted Roosevelt to engage in an ongoing calculus about if and how to respond diplomatically. As Roosevelt considered his options, several factors weighed in favor of some kind of intervention from the Roosevelt administration. For one, Roosevelt had a genuine affinity for the Jewish people, as we have seen. He abhorred the atrocities visited upon the Jews of Kishinev. And Roosevelt was drawn to the idea of America as a moral lodestar for the world. Many of Roosevelt's constituents felt the same way. They were aghast at the grisly details of the Kishinev pogrom. When word of the Kishinev massacre reached American shores, mass protests of Jews and Gentiles alike pleaded for their president to intercede. They imagined that if Roosevelt forcefully spoke out, his words would affirm America's high-minded ideals and shame Russia into reversing its repression. But there were many other factors that weighed against any possible American remonstrance of Russia. For one, there was a strong diplomatic norm at that time of non-interference, wherein one nation was not supposed to comment on the internal affairs of another, even on humanitarian grounds. If Roosevelt were to speak out on behalf of Kishinev's Jews and buck that convention, there was no telling how the Russians might react. They could retaliate by closing prized ports to U.S. trade, or worse still, severing diplomatic ties entirely. Making the issue a little bit more complicated for Roosevelt was America's own scourge of mob violence against a marginalized minority. If Roosevelt were to admonish the Tsar over the pogroms, he might risk provoking an embarrassing censure from the Russian authorities about the raft of lynchings of blacks in the American South. And Roosevelt fretted that speaking out for Russia's Jews might exacerbate rather than mitigate their conditions. He feared that Russian Gentiles, who might resent America's bid to shame them, could reassert their pride by further lashing out at their Jewish neighbors. And perhaps the most important factor militating against Roosevelt's intervention, no other head of state in the world had dared to challenge the Tsar over the pogroms. Roosevelt would be going it alone. As TR considered all of these competing considerations, he summoned to his Sagamore Hill estate out on Long Island an informal group of Jewish advisors to deliberate over the matter. They discussed how best to proceed over lunch together with whichever guest happened to be visiting Roosevelt that day. This is a rather remarkable way of conducting foreign policy, a freewheeling conversation over a meal with not one member of the State Department, but rather a collection of Jewish advisors a British judge, a magazine editor, and Roosevelt's teenage daughter, Alice. This group prevailed upon Roosevelt to take decisive action. He resolved then and there that he would tap the formal channels of American diplomacy to transmit to the Tsar a petition organized by American Jewish leaders and signed by their co-religionists of all faiths. Their fellow citizens, I should say, of various faiths. And that petition would call on the Russian sovereign to protect the life and liberty of his Jewish subjects. Back in America, Roosevelt's Jewish constituents celebrated their president for his forceful defense of their fellow Jews overseas when no other head of state had dared to. But Kishinev did not mark the end of Jewish bloodletting in Tsarist lands. To the contrary, it was merely the beginning of a 3-year wave of violence against Jews that would claim thousands of Jewish lives. Never before in the dark history of the Russian Empire had Jewish blood flowed so freely, and this at a time when Russia was home to nearly half the world's Jewish population. The violence against Jews reached its morbid crescendo in November of 1905, when 600 pogroms broke out in communities all over Russia within a 12-day period. Despite immense public pressure from American Jews on Roosevelt to somehow attempt to intervene, Roosevelt deemed it prudent to abstain from appealing to the Russian government. He thought that any intercession from the United States would be futile because Russian society at large was spiraling into a violent abyss, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the Tsar didn't have control over his own country. And although Roosevelt did have genuine compassion for the Jewish victims in Russian lands, still he had significant doubts about America's ability to police the world. Roosevelt's calculated caution at that moment frustrated longtime Jewish supporters. We see then in the diplomatic realm not one Theodore Roosevelt, but two. The first who inspired his Jewish constituents when he stood up to the Tsar after Kishinev, and the other who disappointed them by exercising strategic restraint 2 years later. Pogroms didn't merely raise a question of foreign policy, but also immigration policy, as Jewish survivors of pogroms packed the docks at American ports. From colonial times until the very eve of Roosevelt's presidency, a period spanning a quarter millennium, America had amassed a Jewish population of 1 million souls. It took only the 2 terms of Roosevelt's presidency to nearly double that number. This unprecedented influx of Jewish refugees raised difficult questions for the nation, both moral and practical. Indigent Jews overwhelmed city slums and saturated the labor market. Whether to accept these desperate souls in unlimited numbers proved a vexing question. As with his Jewish diplomacy, we see 2 Theodore Roosevelts in the realm of immigration, one who earned the affection of Jewish immigrants and another who aggrieved longtime Jewish allies. The Roosevelt who earned their adoration was an outspoken champion of the contributions that Jewish immigrants had made to American life. It was the Roosevelt who chastised his chief immigration officer for turning back Jewish arrivals, warning his officer that turning these Jews back often meant consigning them to a grim fate in their land of origin. His administration celebrated America as an asylum for the world's oppressed. Roosevelt's compassion for Jewish immigrants was on vivid display in his first term in office when he made a dramatic visit to that symbolic speck of land in New York Harbor, Ellis Island. In typical Rooseveltian fashion, the whole day was a string of sensational moments. He boarded a boat in Oyster Bay on Long Island, where his summer home was, and this boat had to forge its way through a tempest that was roiling the Long Island Sound with ferocious winds and frightful waves. Back on Ellis Island, officials had been skeptical that Roosevelt would hazard the trip, but improbably, at 2 o'clock that afternoon, the president's boat came into view. It anchored some distance off of Ellis Island, and a tugboat due to deliver the president the final leg of the journey attempted the ticklish job of defying the howling gale and aligning itself next to the president's vessel. Roosevelt boarded the tug, and he braved that last stretch of the journey on deck despite the relentless rainfall. The president, with a broad grin on his face, enthusiastically waved his signature slouch hat as he came into the wharf. Once docked, a thoroughly soaked Roosevelt raced across a wobbly wooden plank and onto that iconic aisle where every day hundreds of aspiring Americans first set foot. Roosevelt's first order of business was to announce to a press gaggle that had been awaiting him that he was creating a special presidential investigatory committee to uncover discrimination on Ellis Island, and that committee would have Jewish representation on it. Roosevelt spent the next 5 hours touring the island and giving various gestures of courtesy to the newcomers. He shook hands and exchanged words with those waiting in line to be processed. And in one remarkable instance, Roosevelt took it upon himself to personally adjudicate a detention case, and he summarily decided to free a woman who had pleaded with the president for her release. Roosevelt made an even grander gesture for Jewish immigrants in his second term, when he made the rather audacious decision to place American immigration policy in the hands of a foreign-born Jew. This was a striking move at a moment when many old stock Americans were enthralled to a kind of xenophobia that was tinged with anti-Semitism. The Jew selected for this honor was named Oscar Strauss, and he and Roosevelt were distinct by many measures. Roosevelt could enthrall a crowd. Strauss was best suited to backroom diplomacy. Roosevelt epitomized charisma. Strauss was mild-mannered. But Oscar Strauss had a brilliant mind, an inexhaustible work ethic, and a deep sense of personal integrity that Roosevelt admired. By placing Strauss in charge of not just immigration policy, but at the same time commerce, Theodore Roosevelt had made history. Oscar Strauss had become the first Jew in U.S. history to sit in a presidential cabinet. Back in the 1860s, when Strauss had been an undergrad at Columbia, he had been denied membership in a campus literary society on account of his Jewish identity. But now Strauss was conferred membership in the cabinet of an American president. I know it might be hard today to imagine an era when Columbia struggled with anti-Semitism on campus, but try as you might. Now, Roosevelt, for all of his gestures to Jewish immigrants, alienated longtime Jewish friends by throwing his support behind something called the literacy test, which was a bill that was being debated on Capitol Hill. And if that bill passed, literacy in any language would become a prerequisite for admission into the country. Now, the literacy test was on its face neutral, but in practice, it would disproportionately exclude Eastern European Jews and Southern Italians, whose literacy rates were much lower than immigrants from the likes of England or Denmark. Now, Roosevelt's intentions in endorsing the bill were hardly sinister. He was worried that immigrants who had just recently settled stateside would struggle to overcome poverty if their living conditions and wages were perpetually suppressed by an unrestricted deluge of foreign labor. Roosevelt thought that the literacy test could be a useful means of checking industries that he thought were exploiting mass migration. But Roosevelt's position on the bill alienated him from longtime Jewish friends who rightly fretted that if the literacy test passed, it would prove an insurmountable obstacle to countless Jews who were seeking to escape habitual bouts of butchery overseas. And Roosevelt's benevolent intentions aside, his position on the bill placed him on the same side of the issue as prominent xenophobes who wanted to curb Jewish immigration for fear that it was corrupting the nation's racial purity. Now, the literacy test failed to pass Congress, but no thanks to Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt's complicated relationship with the Jewish community took place at a crucial moment, not just for Jews, but for America itself. Once a fragile young republic committed to neutrality abroad, America had now become a global player that was projecting its power well beyond its shores. Once a young nation that was predominantly Anglo-Saxon in character, America increasingly saw her streets packed with strange newcomers speaking in alien tongues. In short, America was coming to the world, and the world was coming to America. But the path to globalization wasn't smoothly paved. Roosevelt found himself navigating foreign resistance to American intervention and domestic anxiety about immigration. The twin challenges confronting Theodore Roosevelt, from massacres to migration, assumed outsized significance in American political life because they threw into vivid relief just how quickly the country had grown daring in its external engagement and diverse in its internal composition. Roosevelt's mixed approach to Jewish affairs aptly reflected a nation uncertain of its own destiny. Would America remain inward-looking, wary of new arrivals, and obtuse to humanitarian crises abroad? Or would the United States embrace the forces of globalization that were collapsing once vast distances between the old world and the new? Roosevelt's checkered answer was of no small moment. At stake for America was nothing less than its very self-conception. At stake for untold Jews was nothing less than their very survival. Theodore Roosevelt passed away a decade after he stepped down from the White House. The night before his funeral, his corpse lay in the trophy room of his Sagamore Hill estate. The room's wood paneling and animal skins lent it the unmistakable air of a hunting lodge. The trophy room was appropriately named. Its many trophies, gifts, and mementos reflected Roosevelt's various sides. There was the Rough Rider saber, representing Roosevelt the soldier. There was a samurai sword, a gift from the Japanese emperor, signifying Roosevelt the diplomat. And there was a golden eagle mounted between the windows, representing Roosevelt the patriot. A tradition common to Judaism and Christianity alike calls on the living to keep watch over the dead before burial. And on that final night in Sagamore Hill, only one person was permitted to keep watch over Roosevelt's body. That honor didn't fall to any of the famous personages who had populated his life, nor to the best man at his wedding, nor even to his eldest child. In those small hours, as the world slept, Roosevelt's sole companion was a Jewish immigrant. It was his old sparring partner from the police force, Otto Raphael. Now, to be sure, the differences between those two men had been striking. The one, a strictly kosher Russian Jew raised in the East Side slums. The other, a silver spoon cowboy with Dutch blood and a Harvard diploma. But Roosevelt treated Raphael as an equal. It could not have been lost on Otto Raphael that back in the Tsar's dominions, he might have been savagely slaughtered. But in the United States, Raphael could keep company with an American president. Theodore Roosevelt was an imperfect leader of an imperfect nation. But Roosevelt genuinely believed, when many others did not, that the likes of Otto Raphael made America a better place. On that last evening in Sagamore Hill, amid a trophy room adorned with the tokens of feats and fame, there could be no finer symbol of the very best in Theodore Roosevelt than that final farewell between two faithful friends. Thank you.
Wow, wow, wow. Okay, any questions? Because if you don't, I do. Is there one thing that you found that made you want to write this book? Something in the archives? I mean, it's so interesting, but how did you land on this?
So, this brings me back to the Jewish world of Alexander Hamilton, which I originally got to speak to your community about. I was interested in Roosevelt because he really liked Hamilton. And this was kind of unusual. Before the Hamilton musical, Hamilton was really the punching bag of the American founders. People esteemed Washington, of course, that's always in vogue. But Jefferson, even Adams, thanks to David McCullough, had his heyday. And the musical sort of changed everything. But before that, throughout much of American history, Hamilton was not a very popular figure. But Roosevelt really admired Hamilton. And I thought, given Hamilton's own connections to the Jewish identity and Hamilton's own philo-Semitism, I wonder if Theodore Roosevelt also had a relationship with the Jewish community and also shared Hamilton's affinity for Jews. And it turns out that there was this incredibly rich set of archival materials that had really been left untouched. And I was talking to the scholar Jonathan Sarna, who's really the world's leading authority on Jewish American history. And we were chatting in his office at Brandeis University, and he said, Theodore Roosevelt he's the one president whom there really needs to be a book about his relationship with Jews, and it hasn't even been attempted yet. And so I was really grateful that it took me 6 years to do the book, but I didn't get scooped, and I got to be the first one to share this story. And in terms of, one thing that really stood out for me from the historical record, I think for me was actually what I just shared, this story about Otto Raphael and kind of bookending the Roosevelt story early in his career. And then there's this one Yiddish speaking, his old sparring partner, raised in the East Side slums, is given this honor of invigilating. And to me, it just spoke volumes about the depth of the sincerity of that friendship he had with Otto Raphael and what that friendship says about Roosevelt and the American Jewish community at large. So I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to be the first to crack the case, and I'm working on a sequel just on his post-presidency, which involves a whole other host of Jewish issues, including his relationship with a young cohort of Jewish female writers writing about the Jewish immigrant experience that he helped boost, including his relationship with Zionism. He was a very vocal supporter of Jewish control over the Holy Land. And so if I'm lucky, maybe I'll get invited back in a couple of years when that comes out, and I'll have a chance to chat with you guys about Roosevelt in the post-presidential years.
Now we know how to get a hold of you. Darren, the book is here. Gary.
So if you know, did Taft and Wilson build on what Roosevelt had started, or did it sort of end after Roosevelt's term?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I, with the help of a couple diligent research assistants, am the first person to go through the Lower East Side block by block and actually tally what the Jewish vote was across multiple elections. And Roosevelt outran every Republican of the era. He's the only Republican of that era to actually win the Lower East Side. And to give you a sense of how Roosevelt compared to some of these other figures, you can look at his coattails. And so there was a district, a state legislative seat on the East Side that had gone for Democrats 30 elections in a row, but with Roosevelt at the top of the ticket, it went Republican. If you look at the Jewish congressman, a Democrat who represented the Lower East Side in Congress, he won by an average of 30 points per election cycle, except when Roosevelt was at the top of the ticket, he narrowly squeaked out a 2-point victory. And so Roosevelt had remade the political map with Jewish voters, but Taft was not able to recreate that. And a lot of Jews were really frustrated with Taft because they wanted Taft to abrogate America's treaty with Russia, which Russia was not respecting because they weren't allowing American Jews into the country. And it's not the case that American Jews were dying to go to Russia, but they took offense at the idea that Russia was dividing up Americans into two classes, Jew and Gentile, and treating them separately, when America had a treaty that did not allow for that kind of religious classification. That would have been a repugnant to the American Constitution. And the bigger issue was that American Jews thought, well, if Russia can recognize American Jews as standing on an equality with American Gentiles, it will create a domino effect where their own subjugation of their own Jews will not be able to endure that inconsistency, because foreign Jews will be able to get into Russia and be afforded the full privileges and rights that domestic Russian Jews weren't allowed. And Taft was not making movement on that issue. And that was a real source of frustration. And it's a remarkable moment where the Jewish community says, we're not going to be court Jews anymore trying to win favor with political leadership. We are going to launch the biggest endeavor in the history of Jewish persuasion in American politics. And they send not emails, they send letters and telegrams, and they publish pamphlets and reports, and they reach out to journalists and clergymen and people all over the country. And this effort is so effective that despite Taft's resistance, they get, save for one vote in the House of Representatives, they get unanimous support in Congress for abrogating this treaty with Russia. And it was really a sign of the power that American Jewry has when it acts as a unified voice and it builds bridges to our Gentile neighbors in a spirit of shared American humanitarianism. So thank you very much for that question.
FDR was like Seneca's.
Yeah, I think fifth. Yeah. Yeah.
So the question is, FDR did not to share the same friendly feeling towards the Jews that Teddy Roosevelt had. Do you agree? Or?
Yeah, well, I should say I'll approach the question with a little bit of circumspection because I'm not an FDR scholar, but I do know that there's a very lively debate among historians who do study FDR and the Jews. There's been a number of books written about FDR and the Jews debating whether he could have done more, how much more he could have done more to save Jewish lives. And my sense of that scholarly literature is that its center of gravity is that FDR's track record on saving Jews was not nearly as strong as it could have been. And so I think that you see, listen, Roosevelt, as I talked about today, sometimes frustrated some of his Jewish supporters, but oftentimes that was because he feared that he was actually endangering Russian Jews by speaking out. It seems to me, based on what I know about FDR, that TR stacks up pretty favorably. But as I mentioned in the introduction of the book, I'm trying to get the history right, and it's your prerogative as readers of the book to decide for yourselves whether this changes your view of TR and how you think TR stacks up against some of the other presidents. So I leave that to you, the reader, to ultimately decide. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Professor. Teddy Roosevelt, the only Republican president to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. And this has to do with the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah.
So he has further diplomatic involvement with Russia. Could you discuss how that went?
Yeah.
In light of everything that happened before.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that because but my wife, who I'm very grateful has joined me. We call her the only Jewish Christian west of the Mississippi, and for whom the book is named. She and I actually met in Portsmouth, and so Portsmouth is an important site not just in the book but in our lives. And in this story, you see, Russia and Roosevelt are in this very bloody war, 1904 to 1905, over control of Manchuria and Korea in the Far East. And Roosevelt is concerned that he certainly doesn't want Russia to win, but he doesn't want Japan to absolutely crush Russia because he wants to maintain an equilibrium, a balance of power in the Far East that he thinks is going to be favorable to America's own interests in the region. And so Roosevelt is laboring very hard to get both sides to the bargaining table. And he convinces both of them to come to Portsmouth, New Hampshire in August of 1905. Roosevelt notably does not attend the peace conference, but such is Roosevelt's influence that he manages to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That, I guess the only Republican to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the first American to win a Nobel Prize in any category for his role in a conference he didn't attend. But he was functionally there because he was back at Oyster Bay, what they called the summer White House of Sagamore Hill, sending out a flurry of telegrams to Portsmouth, to Tokyo, to St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia at the time, and helping them to find some way forward with peace talks that looked very much like they were careening towards collapse. And what's really interesting is the Jewish angle here. And there's a Jewish Chicago angle here because the head of B'nai B'rith, the oldest Jewish service organization in America at that time, was a guy named Adolph Lewison, who had been the campaign manager for one of the Chicago mayors. And he was now taking on this role for B'nai B'rith, and he reaches out to the Russian consul in Chicago, and he says, I want to gather a delegation of Jewish leaders to meet with Sergei Witte, who was basically the prime minister of Russia, and he was personally going to come to Portsmouth to conduct the Russo-Japanese peace negotiations in New Hampshire. And he basically says, I want some time during the peace negotiations because what the Jewish community is thinking in America is Russia is on its back foot militarily, it's on its back foot politically. This might be an opportunity to press for concessions for Jewish rights. And Russia's war effort was particularly beleaguered because the Russians had been unable to float war bonds on the American market because American Jewish bankers had made it impossible for them to get the funding that they needed to carry on the war. So they felt like they had some real leverage. And Adolf Lewison, along with one of the other members of this Jewish delegation, meet with Theodore Roosevelt in Coney Island to discuss strategy. And they agree that these Jews are going to have their own kind of shadow diplomacy that's happening in concert with the Russo-Japanese negotiations. And then Roosevelt, through his own back channels, is going to be complementing their efforts. And Roosevelt puts pressure on Sergei Witte privately in tandem with the pressure that the Jews put on Witte when they meet with him in Portsmouth to offer concessions on Jewish rights. And what's really striking to me about this is that I found no evidence that anyone in the State Department had any idea that Roosevelt was doing this. Roosevelt's Secretary of State almost resigned out of frustration because he thought Roosevelt was going too far to alienate Russia in defense of the Jewish community. And publicly he claimed, oh, I never thought about resigning, but I found letters in the archives where he tells his wife, I'm going to have to resign. I can't stick around for this. But ultimately Roosevelt persuaded him to stay. But that doesn't mean Roosevelt listened to him on Jewish issues. And so the Russo-Japanese War is, I have a whole chapter on it's called Peace at Portsmouth on that subject, because there's such an important Jewish angle here to the Russo-Japanese War. And the Japanese understood how significant Jewish issues were to all of this, that there are actually Japanese newspapers that are writing about the pogroms because they realize that the pogroms have the potential to push America to side with Japan against Russia, which is exactly what happens. And actually, speaking of Jonathan Sarna, one of his PhD students that he mentored was from Japan. And so she's one of the few people in Jewish studies who's able to read Japanese fluently. And she actually found all of these Japanese articles that she translated writing about Jewish issues. And I was able to lift some of her translations and incorporate them into the book. There's a lot that I didn't get to cover, so no pressure, but the book will be available for sale after the Q&A.
Thank you very much for a wonderful history lesson. I appreciate your knowledge.
Thank you.
And I have a question regarding during the Taft administration.
Yeah.
My father was once in what was then called here, and during the pogroms, and came to this country in 1912, and they left because of the pogrom. And I'm wondering if there's any mention of what happened in Kiev.
So I don't, this book only goes up to 1909. And so the Taft years, which are important to the broader Roosevelt story, are going to be the subject in part of the sequel. And so when I come back in a couple of years, pending an invitation, I'll be taking up that issue. So you're one step ahead of me, but I'm working on it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All I have to say as an English teacher and not a history teacher, that if I had had you in high school, my whole idea of how history should be taught, you would be the example of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You're too kind.
So you told us what you're going to be writing next. But I would like to ask, if Roosevelt were alive today, how might he navigate current discussions around anti-Semitism in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Roosevelt, I think that we can get a hint of this question in the 1908 election. So Roosevelt, at that time, there were not term limits on presidents, but Roosevelt respects the precedent set by George Washington to step down from the White House. And at this time, this was before there's a cleavage between Taft and Roosevelt. Roosevelt actually handpicks Taft, his Secretary of War, to be his successor as president, and the party and the country, fall in line. During that race, there were a lot of people who were trying to discredit Taft by calling into question his religious beliefs. And they claimed, at a time of real anti-Catholic sentiment, they claimed that his wife and brother were Catholics, even though they weren't. They were casting aspersions about Taft's Unitarianism. and William Jennings Bryan, who was running against Taft, had a certain history of playing footsie with anti-Semites, shall we say. And so Roosevelt is really, really angry that anybody is even talking about Taft's faith as a relevant question in a presidential election. In our Constitution, and I talk about this in my Hamilton book at greater length, in our Constitution, everyone knows about the free exercise clause, but there's a lesser known clause buried in Article 6 that I argue in the Hamilton book is even more important than the free exercise clause. And it is a clause banning religious tests for office, meaning nobody can be excluded from service in any federal office, from a petty bureaucrat to the president of the United States, because of their religious beliefs. And for Roosevelt, that was sacrosanct. And so Roosevelt holds his tongue during the election because he didn't even want to dignify these attacks on Taft's religion. But when Roosevelt, after Taft wins, Roosevelt writes a scorching letter back to somebody who had written him personally a letter questioning Taft's religious beliefs. And Roosevelt offers this very full-throated defense of religious liberty in America. And he cites the fact that there were numerous Jewish politicians that had been elected in districts or in areas where there weren't very many Jews. And he says, you're being un-American, and we can see in the Jewish American experience the liberality of the American people. And he predicts that there will be Jewish presidents in the future. And Roosevelt's letter is read aloud in synagogues all over the country. And Jewish families kept copies of that letter because they wanted to share it with their children and their grandchildren. And I think that letter is as relevant today as it was back then. And I have a lot of confidence that Roosevelt, without equivocation, just as he did in 1908, would call out Jew hatred for what it is and would insist that in the United States of America, when Jews lay claim to their stake in this republic, they do so with the wind of history at their back. So thank you very much for that question.
He'll be here for Andrew to sign our books, and a great Hanukkah present, what can I say? And next week we're virtual, and Jane Eisner will be talking about at 10 a.m. Carol King. So it's going to be another fun morning, but this was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.